When I told my roommate her boyfriend was arrested for assault, she said, "You think I'm going to abandon him just because he has a disease?" "Assault isn't a disease, Madison," I said, while she stood in our apartment holding hands with Jake, who'd just gotten out on bail that morning for beating up a bartender. Madison rolled her eyes and pulled Jake inside, even though I'd specifically told her he wasn't allowed in our apartment anymore. "You're so ignorant about mental health conditions. Anger management disorder is a real disease." She said this like she was educating me while Jake smirked behind her. Our other roommate, Haley, came out of her room and immediately backed away, seeing Jake. "Madison, why is he here?" "We voted. He's banned from the apartment." Madison laughed and walked to the couch, pulling Jake with her. "You can't discriminate against someone for having a medical condition. That's literally illegal." Jake sat down and put his feet on our coffee table, knocking over Haley's textbooks. Besides, the charges were dropped. That was a lie because I'd checked the court records that morning. No, they weren't. "He has a hearing next Tuesday." Madison waved her hand, dismissive. "The bartender provoked him by cutting him off. That's basically assault on the bartender's part." Jake nodded along. "Exactly, babe. He triggered my condition by refusing to serve me." He looked at me with this threatening smile. "Some people just don't understand invisible disabilities." I pulled out my phone to show Madison the actual police report. "He broke the guy's nose and gave him a concussion. That's not a disability, that's violence." Madison snatched my phone and deleted the file. "Stop spreading ableist propaganda. Would you shame someone for having diabetes?" Haley finally spoke up. "Madison, he also has a restraining order from his ex-girlfriend." Madison's face lit up like this proved her point. "See? Another woman who couldn't handle dating someone with a medical condition. The stigma is disgusting." Jake leaned back, spreading out more. "My ex was ableist too. She called the cops just because I had an episode." Madison rubbed his arm, sympathetic. "People don't understand that violence is just a symptom like sneezing or coughing." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "He pushed his ex down a flight of stairs." Madison stood up, angry now. "He didn't mean to. His condition makes him lose control sometimes." She went to the kitchen and started making Jake food with our groceries. "You wouldn't blame someone with Tourette's for cursing, would you?" Jake followed her and opened our fridge, taking Haley's labeled lunch. "This looks good." He started eating it straight from the container. "Jake, that's mine," Haley said, but he ignored her. Madison handed him more of our food. "He needs to keep his blood sugar stable. It helps with his episodes." She glared at us. "If you two were supportive roommates, you'd understand." That's when our neighbor, Mrs. Coleman, knocked on the door. She was 75 and lived alone next door. I opened it and she looked terrified. "Is that man back? The one who was yelling last week?" Before I could answer, Jake appeared behind me. "You got a problem, lady?" Mrs. Coleman stepped back. "Please don't let him near my apartment." "I'm scared." Madison pushed past me. "How dare you discriminate against him? He has a medical condition." Mrs. Coleman looked confused. "Medical condition?" "He threatened to break my door down because my TV was too loud at 4 p.m. Madison got in her face. "That's a symptom of his sensitivity disorder. Loud noises trigger him." Jake smiled at Mrs. Coleman in a way that made her back up more. "Maybe you should be more considerate of people with disabilities." Mrs. Coleman hurried back to her apartment and I heard her deadbolt lock. Madison turned on me. "Look what you've done. You've turned the whole building against him." She went back inside and started pulling my stuff off the wall. "We need to make this a safe space for Jake." She threw my photos in a box. "These might trigger his episodes." Haley grabbed her purse. "I'm staying at my boyfriend's tonight." "This is insane." Madison blocked her path. "You're really going to abandon us because Jake has a disease? What if he had cancer?" Haley pushed past her. "Cancer doesn't give people black eyes, Madison." After she left, Madison got worse. "Jake's moving in. He needs a supportive environment for his recovery." I laughed, but it wasn't funny. "Recovery from what? He's not sick, he's violent." Jake stood up fast and his fist clenched. "You calling me violent?" Madison jumped between us. "Don't trigger him. You know what happens when his condition flares up." She actually said this like it was my fault if he hit me. "If he touches me, I'm calling the cops." Jake was getting closer to me. "Your roommate seems pretty mad already. Maybe she needs medication." Madison gasped, excited. "You're right, baby. She probably has the same condition but undiagnosed." She looked at me with fake concern. "Your anger about Jake is actually a symptom. You should get tested." That's when our landlord Rick walked in. I'd texted him earlier and he'd used his key. "Jake Hoffman, you're not on the lease and you're not welcome here." Rick pulled out his phone and held it up. Madison's crying turned to full panic mode as she grabbed his arm. Jake stayed on the couch, but his whole body went tight like he was ready to spring. Rick shook Madison off and started dialing. Madison threw herself between Rick and Jake, screaming about how Jake had nowhere to go, and stress was dangerous for his condition. She kept saying the word vulnerable over and over like it was a magic spell that would make Rick put his phone down. Rick finished dialing and held the phone to his ear. Jake stood up real slow with his fists still clenched at his sides. He stared at Rick without blinking for what felt like forever. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The silence made my skin crawl. Finally, Jake walked toward the door, but he moved like a predator that was choosing to leave, not being forced out. He stopped right next to me so close I could smell the beer on his breath. He leaned in and whispered so quiet only I could hear, "This isn't over." Then he walked out and slammed the door hard enough to rattle the pictures still left on the walls. Madison ran after him, but Rick blocked her path. She screamed and tried to push past him, but he just stood there solid as a wall. Rick put his phone away and looked at Madison with this disappointed expression. He told her she was breaking her lease by having Jake stay here. If Jake came back even once, Rick would start the process to kick her out. Madison's face went from crying to pure rage in a second. She started yelling about discrimination and disabilities and lawsuits. She said she'd call a lawyer and sue Rick for everything he had. Rick just shook his head and walked out. The door clicked shut behind him and Madison turned on me. The look in her eyes made me take a step back. She said I ruined everything. I destroyed her relationship and Jake's recovery, and now he might never get better, and it was all my fault. Her voice got louder with every word until she was screaming. Then she stormed to her room and slammed the door so hard something fell off the wall in the hallway. I heard her on the phone immediately. Her voice was muffled through the door, but I caught Jake's name and words like "come back and when he's gone and we'll figure it out." My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and texted Haley. I told her what happened with Rick and Jake leaving and Madison losing it. Haley responded in under a minute. She said she was staying at her boyfriend's place for the rest of the week, maybe longer. She didn't feel safe coming back with Madison acting crazy and Jake threatening to return. I typed back that I understood and I didn't blame her at all. But now I was alone in the apartment with Madison, who clearly wanted me dead. I went to my room and locked the door. Then I pushed my dresser in front of it. It barely moved at first because it was so heavy, but I got it wedged against the door eventually. I sat on my bed and tried to do homework, but I couldn't focus. Every sound made me jump. I heard Madison moving around the apartment, heard her in the kitchen, heard her pacing in the hallway. Around midnight, I tried to sleep, but I kept waking up at every noise. The building settling, a car outside, Madison's footsteps. Around 3 in the morning, I heard the apartment door open. My heart started pounding so hard I thought it would break through my chest. I heard Jake's voice in the living room talking quiet with Madison. I couldn't make out the words, but I recognized his voice immediately. I stayed frozen in my bed, barely breathing. I heard them moving around out there for what felt like hours. Finally, I must have fallen asleep from pure exhaustion, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was coming through my window. I pushed the dresser away from my door as quiet as I could and opened it just a crack. I crept down the hallway and looked into the living room. Jake was asleep on our couch with Madison curled up next to him. All my textbooks that I'd left on the coffee table were scattered on the floor. I went to the kitchen and opened the fridge. Every single thing Haley and I had labeled with our names was gone. Empty containers sat in the sink. Jake and Madison had eaten everything. I pulled out my phone and took photos of Jake on the couch. I made sure to get the timestamp in the corner showing it was 7 in the morning. Then I took photos of the empty fridge and the mess in the living room. I sent everything to Rick with a message saying Jake came back last night and has been here for hours. Rick texted back within 10 minutes saying he was coming over right now and bringing police this time. I went back to my room and got dressed fast. I heard Madison and Jake starting to wake up. Their voices got louder. I stayed in my room until I heard knocking at the front door. I opened my bedroom door and saw Madison jumping up from the couch. Rick stood in the doorway with a police officer in uniform. The officer's name tag said Conway. Rick pointed at Jake and told Officer Conway this was the guy who wasn't allowed here. Madison started talking fast, saying Jake just got here 5 minutes ago and she was about to make him leave. Officer Conway looked at me and I held up my phone showing him the time-stamped photos from over an hour ago. Conway asked Madison if she understood she was lying to a police officer. Madison's face went white. Jake stood up and tried to walk toward the door like he was just going to leave. Officer Conway stepped in front of him and told him to wait. Conway pulled out his radio and called in Jake's name. We all stood there in awful silence while Conway waited for the response. Finally, his radio crackled and I heard the dispatcher say something about bail violation. Conway looked at Jake and told him he violated his bail conditions by being at our apartment after Rick banned him yesterday. Jake started arguing, but Conway was already pulling out handcuffs. He told Jake to turn around and put his hands behind his back. Jake looked at Madison like she could save him, but she just stood there frozen. Conway handcuffed Jake right there in our living room while reading him his rights. Madison lunged toward me with her hands reaching for my face, but Officer Conway stepped between us and grabbed her shoulders. She twisted in his grip, trying to get past him while screaming that I was a monster who didn't understand real medical conditions. Her face was red and tears ran down her cheeks as she yelled that Jake needed treatment, not jail. Officer Conway told her to calm down, or he'd have to restrain her too. She kept screaming that I was sending an innocent sick person to jail, and that I was the most ablest person she'd ever met. Jake watched from the doorway in handcuffs with this weird smile on his face like he enjoyed seeing Madison defend him even now. Officer Conway finally had to physically push Madison back toward the couch, while telling her she needed to stop or she'd be arrested for interfering with an officer. She collapsed onto the couch, sobbing and yelling that this was all my fault. Rick stood near the door looking uncomfortable but determined. Officer Conway led Jake out of the apartment, and I heard Jake tell Madison he loved her, and that this would all work out. Madison screamed back that she loved him too and would wait for him. The door closed, and suddenly the apartment felt very quiet, except for Madison's crying. Rick pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket and walked over to where Madison sat on the couch. He told her this was a formal lease violation notice, and she had 48 hours to prove Jake wouldn't return or face immediate eviction. Madison looked up at him with mascara running down her face and snatched the paper from his hand. She read it for maybe 5 seconds before tearing it into pieces and throwing them at Rick. The paper scraps scattered across the floor between them. Rick's face stayed calm, and he told her that wouldn't change anything because he had copies and would file them with the property management company. Madison stood up and got in his face, telling him he couldn't do this to her. Rick stepped back and said she'd violated the lease multiple times by having an unauthorized person stay here after being warned. He reminded her that Jake had threatened other tenants and created an unsafe environment. Madison screamed that he was discriminating against Jake's disability, and she'd sue him and the whole building. Rick just shook his head and said the notice stood and she had 2 days to comply. He looked at me and asked if I was okay. I nodded, even though I wasn't really. He told me to call him if anything else happened and then left the apartment. Madison turned on me as soon as the door closed. She said I'd ruined everything and destroyed her relationship with the only person who truly understood her. I didn't respond because there was nothing to say that would get through to her. She went to her room and slammed the door so hard a picture fell off the wall in the hallway. I stood there in the living room looking at the torn pieces of the lease violation notice scattered on the floor. My hands were shaking and I realized I needed to call someone. I went to my room and closed the door and locked it. I sat on my bed and pulled out my phone and called my parents. My mom answered on the second ring asking if everything was okay because I usually texted instead of calling. I told her everything that had just happened with Jake getting arrested and Madison losing it and the lease violation. My mom's voice got really worried and she said I needed to come home right now. She said I could finish the semester online and it wasn't safe for me to stay there. I explained that I only had 2 months left and my classes required in-person attendance, and I couldn't just abandon everything. My mom started crying and said she couldn't sleep knowing I was in danger. My dad got on the phone and his voice was calmer, but I could tell he was worried too. My dad asked me specific questions about Jake's history and the restraining order from his ex. I told him everything I knew, including how Jake had pushed his ex downstairs and broken her arm. My dad was quiet for a minute and then said I needed to get a restraining order against Jake myself. He said Jake had threatened me and had a clear pattern of violence against women, and I needed legal protection. I hadn't thought about getting a restraining order because Jake was in jail now, but my dad explained that Jake would eventually get out and might come after me for getting him arrested. That made my stomach feel sick because I knew he was right. My dad looked up the courthouse information online while we were on the phone and told me I could file for a temporary restraining order tomorrow morning. He said he'd pay for a lawyer if I needed one, but usually the courthouse had advocates who could help with the paperwork. I wrote down the courthouse address and the office hours. My dad made me promise to go first thing in the morning and to keep my phone charged and with me at all times. My mom got back on the phone and begged me again to come home, but I told her I'd be okay, and I'd call them tomorrow after I filed the restraining order. After we hung up, I sat on my bed feeling exhausted, even though it was only afternoon. Around 6 that evening, someone knocked hard on the apartment door. I looked through the peephole and saw an older couple I didn't recognize standing in the hallway. The woman looked angry and the man looked tired. I opened the door with the chain still attached and asked who they were. The woman immediately started yelling that I was the roommate who got Jake arrested. I realized these must be Madison's parents. The woman pushed against the door, demanding I let them in so we could talk about what I'd done to ruin Madison's life. The man put his hand on her arm and told her to calm down, but she ignored him. I unhooked the chain and opened the door because I figured they'd keep making noise in the hallway otherwise. Madison's mom pushed past me into the apartment while her dad followed, looking apologetic. Madison came out of her room and ran to her mom crying. Her mom hugged her and started saying how terrible this all was and how I'd destroyed everything. Madison's dad stood near the door and nodded at me with this sad expression. Madison's mom kept yelling about how Jake was a good man with a medical condition, and I'd gotten him thrown in jail like some kind of criminal. I pointed out that Jake was actually a criminal because he'd assaulted someone and violated his bail. That made Madison's mom even angrier, and she started listing all the ways I was wrong about Jake. Madison's dad finally spoke up and asked if he could talk to me privately for a minute. His wife glared at him, but he guided me toward the kitchen anyway. Once we were out of earshot, he turned to me and his whole face changed. He looked exhausted and worried, and he quietly said he was sorry for his wife and daughter. He said he'd been worried about Madison's relationship with Jake for months, but nobody would listen to him. He told me Jake had been controlling Madison and isolating her from her friends, and he'd tried to talk to Madison about it, but she wouldn't hear it. He said his wife thought Jake was just passionate and misunderstood, but he knew better. He asked me to please be patient while they tried to get Madison to see reason. He said they were going to try to get her into therapy and help her understand that Jake was dangerous. I told him I appreciated that, but Madison had 48 hours to prove Jake wouldn't come back or she'd be evicted. Madison's dad looked pained and said he understood and he'd work on it. We went back to the living room where Madison's mom was still telling Madison that everything would be okay and that Jake clearly loved her. I heard Madison's mom telling her that sometimes men with strong personalities just need understanding women who can handle their intensity. She said Jake obviously cared deeply about Madison, or he wouldn't get so emotional about things. Madison was nodding along and wiping her tears. Her mom said that weak women couldn't handle men like Jake, but Madison was strong enough to see past his rough exterior to his good heart. Madison's dad tried to interrupt and said that wasn't healthy relationship advice, but his wife waved him off. She told Madison that her own father had a temper when they first got married, but she'd learned how to manage it, and now they had a wonderful marriage. Madison's dad's face went red, and he said that wasn't true, and she was rewriting history. Madison's mom ignored him completely, and kept talking to Madison about how real love means accepting someone's flaws. She said if Madison abandoned Jake now when he needed her most, she'd regret it forever. Madison's dad raised his voice and said Jake was violent and dangerous, and Madison needed to stay away from him. Madison's mom finally looked at him and told him he was being dramatic, and didn't understand modern relationships. The argument between Madison's parents got louder and more intense, until finally Madison's dad said they needed to leave. After Madison's parents left, the apartment got really quiet. Madison went back to her room without looking at me. I heard her moving around in there and drawers opening and closing. About an hour later, she came out carrying a big duffel bag stuffed with clothes. She announced that she was moving in with Jake's friend, because we'd all made her feel unwelcome in her own home. I asked her which friend, and she said it didn't matter because at least they understood what Jake was going through. She said she'd still pay her portion of the rent, but she wouldn't be staying here anymore. I didn't try to stop her because honestly I was relieved she was leaving. She grabbed a few more things from the bathroom and the kitchen and then walked toward the door. Before she left, she turned and said, "I'd regret this someday when I realized what I'd done." Then she was gone and I heard her footsteps going down the hallway. I locked the door behind her and stood there feeling this weird mix of relief and worry. I was glad she was leaving because the tension had been unbearable, but I was scared about her safety living with Jake's friends who probably thought just like Madison did. I texted Haley that Madison had moved out and it was safe to come back. Haley responded within minutes saying she'd be there in an hour. I called Rick and told him what happened and asked if we could change the locks. Rick said absolutely, and he'd come by tomorrow morning with new locks for the front door. He asked if Madison had taken her key, and I said I didn't know, but probably. He said he'd change the locks anyway, just to be safe. When Haley got back that night, she looked relieved to see Madison was really gone. We spent the evening talking about everything that had happened and making plans for how to handle the next few weeks. Haley said her boyfriend's roommate might want to take Madison's room if she really wasn't coming back. I told her about the restraining order I was filing tomorrow, and she said she'd come with me for support. We ordered pizza and watched stupid movies trying to relax, but I kept thinking about Madison living with Jake's friends, and what might happen when Jake eventually got out of jail. That night, I barely slept again, even though Madison wasn't in the apartment anymore. The next morning, Haley and I drove to the courthouse right when it opened. The building was old with high ceilings and lots of people waiting in lines at different windows. I found the clerk's office for restraining orders and told the woman at the window I needed to file a temporary order against someone. She handed me a stack of forms and pointed to some chairs where I could fill them out. The forms asked for detailed information about why I needed protection and what threats had been made. I wrote down everything about Jake threatening me in the apartment and his pattern of violence with his ex and the bartender. I included the assault conviction and the restraining order his ex had gotten. The clerk was really helpful and looked over my forms to make sure I'd filled everything out right. She explained that a judge would review my petition today, and if approved, I'd get a temporary restraining order good for 2 weeks until a full hearing. She said the temporary order would be served to Jake in jail, and he'd be notified that he had to stay away from me. I waited in the courtroom lobby for almost 2 hours before they called my case. The building was old and cold with uncomfortable plastic chairs that made my back hurt. Other people sat around me filling out forms or talking quietly with lawyers. A woman across from me kept crying while her lawyer patted her shoulder. I checked my phone every few minutes, but there were no messages from anyone. Finally, a bailiff opened the courtroom door and called my name along with Jake's full name. I walked into the courtroom, which was smaller than I expected, with just a few rows of benches, and the judge's bench up front. The judge was an older woman with gray hair and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She looked at me and pointed to a chair near the front. I sat down, and the bailiff handed her my paperwork. She read through everything, slowly turning pages and making small notes with a pen. Her expression changed as she read, getting more serious with each page. She looked up at me over her glasses and asked me to stand and raise my right hand. I swore to tell the truth, and she started asking me questions about what happened with Jake. I told her about the threats in the apartment and how he got close to me with his fists clenched. I described finding him on our couch after Rick had banned him, and how he violated the ban immediately. I explained about his ex-girlfriend's restraining order and the assault case with the bartender. The judge kept writing notes and asking follow-up questions about specific dates and times. She asked if Jake had ever physically touched me, and I said no, but he had threatened me multiple times. She asked if I felt afraid for my safety, and I said yes, absolutely. The whole testimony took maybe 15 minutes. When I finished, the judge looked back at my paperwork and read through Jake's criminal history again. She shook her head slightly and stamped something on the forms. She looked at me and said she was granting the temporary restraining order effective immediately for 2 weeks until the full hearing. She said Jake would be served the order in jail, and would be notified that he must stay at least 500 feet away from me at all times. She said if he violated the order, he would face additional criminal charges. I thanked her and she nodded, then called the next case. I walked out of the courtroom feeling this huge relief wash over me. At least now there was something official protecting me, even if it was just a piece of paper. I drove home from the courthouse, taking the route I always took down Main Street past the grocery store and the gas station. The sun was setting and everything looked normal and peaceful. I pulled into my apartment parking lot and immediately saw something was wrong with my car. I parked and got out and my stomach dropped. Someone had keyed my car on both sides with deep scratches that went all the way through the paint down to the metal. On the driver's side, they had scratched the word snitch in huge letters. On the passenger side, they had scratched it again. The scratches were fresh and bright silver against my dark blue paint. I stood there staring at my car, feeling sick. I pulled out my phone and called Officer Conway. He answered on the second ring and I told him what happened. He said he would be there in 10 minutes. I waited by my car, taking photos of the damage from every angle. Other people walked past going to their apartments, and some of them stared at my car, but nobody said anything. Officer Conway arrived in his patrol car and parked next to me. He got out and walked around my car, looking at the scratches closely. He took out a camera and photographed everything himself. He asked me when I had last seen my car without damage, and I said this morning when I left for the courthouse. He wrote that down in his notebook. He asked if I had any idea who might have done this, and I said probably one of Jake's friends since Jake was still in jail. Officer Conway nodded and said that was his thought too. He told me Jake's bail had been revoked after he violated the conditions by coming to my apartment. Jake was still sitting in county jail waiting for his assault trial. But Jake had friends who were angry about what happened, and one of them could have done this. Officer Conway filled out a vandalism report and gave me a copy for my insurance. He said I should start parking in a different spot, maybe around back or on a different street. He also suggested I vary my routine and not come and go at the same times every day. He said Jake's friends might be watching my patterns, and I should make it harder for them to predict where I would be. I thanked him, and he said he would increase patrols past my apartment for the next few weeks. After he left, I went inside and locked the door behind me. I felt violated and angry that they had damaged my car just because I had protected myself. That night, I couldn't sleep again, so I opened my laptop and started searching for information about Jake online. I typed his full name into Google, and dozens of results came up. The first few were news articles about his recent arrest for assaulting the bartender. I scrolled past those and found his social media accounts, which were mostly private. Then I found court records from 2 years ago. I clicked on the link and it opened a PDF of his ex-girlfriend's restraining order petition. Her name was blacked out for privacy, but the details were all there. She described meeting Jake at a party and how charming he was at first. He took her on nice dates and bought her flowers and seemed perfect. But after a few months, he started getting jealous and controlling. He would check her phone and get angry if she talked to other guys, even just friends. He would show up at her work unannounced to make sure she was really there. When she tried to break up with him, he would cry and apologize and promise to change. She gave him another chance and things would be good for a week or two, then the cycle would start again. The violence started small, with him grabbing her arm too hard or pushing her during arguments. He always apologized after and blamed stress from work or family problems. Then one night they were arguing at the top of a staircase in her apartment building. She told him to leave and he shoved her hard. She fell down the entire flight of stairs and broke her arm in 2 places. She had to have surgery to put pins in her arm. The court documents included photos of her injuries and they made me feel sick. Her arm was bent at a wrong angle and covered in bruises. Jake was arrested, but he claimed it was an accident and that she had tripped. His lawyer argued Jake had anger management issues and needed treatment, not jail time. The judge gave him probation and ordered him to take anger management classes. His ex-girlfriend got a 2-year restraining order, but the document said she had moved to a different state to get away from him. I read through the whole thing twice, taking in every detail. This wasn't just some isolated incident. Jake had done this before and he would do it again. I kept searching and found more information. I typed Jake's name into Facebook and found a local group called Safe Dating Network, where people posted warnings about dangerous people they had dated. I requested to join the group and was approved within an hour. I searched Jake's name in the group and found 3 different posts from 3 different women. The first post was from a woman who dated Jake for 6 months. She described the same pattern his ex-girlfriend had mentioned. Charm at first, then jealousy and control, then violence. She said Jake punched a hole in her wall during an argument and threw her phone across the room, breaking it. When she tried to leave, he blocked the door and wouldn't let her out for hours. She finally escaped when he fell asleep and she never went back. The second post was from a woman who only dated Jake for a few weeks. She said he seemed great at first, but then got weird and possessive really fast. He showed up at her house at 2 in the morning demanding to know where she had been. When she told him to leave, he kicked her front door so hard it cracked the frame. She called the police, but Jake left before they arrived. She broke up with him over text, and he sent her hundreds of threatening messages until she blocked his number. The third post was from a woman who worked with Jake at a warehouse job. She said Jake asked her out and she politely declined because she had a boyfriend. Jake started harassing her at work, making sexual comments and following her to her car. When she reported him to their supervisor, Jake got fired. A week later, someone slashed all 4 of her tires in the work parking lot. She couldn't prove it was Jake, but she knew it was him. All 3 women described Jake blaming his behavior on stress or mental health problems. All 3 said he was calculating and manipulative, not impulsive. I screenshot all 3 posts and saved them to a folder on my computer. The next morning, I composed an email to Constance Burnett, the district attorney handling Jake's assault case against the bartender. I had gotten her email from the courthouse website. I attached all the screenshots from the Facebook posts and the court documents from his ex-girlfriend's restraining order case. I wrote that I was the person who had filed the recent restraining order against Jake, and I thought she should know about his history. I explained that Jake had a pattern of targeting women and using violence, then blaming it on medical conditions or stress. I said the bartender he assaulted wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a long pattern of violent behavior. I hit send and didn't expect to hear back right away, but she responded within 2 hours. Her email thanked me for sending the information and said it was extremely helpful. She said evidence of pattern behavior would strengthen their case significantly. In assault cases, the prosecution had to prove intent, and a pattern of similar behavior made it harder for the defense to claim it was an accident or mental health episode. She said my evidence showed Jake's violence was calculated and repeated, not impulsive. She asked if I would be willing to testify at his trial if needed, and I said yes, absolutely. She thanked me again and said she would be in touch as the trial date approached. I felt good knowing I had done something concrete to help stop Jake. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from Madison. I almost didn't read it, but curiosity got the better of me. The message was long and rambling. She said I was obsessed with destroying Jake and that I needed to get help for my own mental health issues. She said I was spreading lies about him online and trying to turn everyone against him. She said real friends would support her relationship instead of trying to sabotage it. She said I was jealous because I didn't have a boyfriend and couldn't stand seeing her happy. She said Jake was getting sicker in jail without proper treatment, and if anything happened to him, it would be my fault. The whole message was unhinged, and I could practically hear her voice getting more hysterical with each sentence. I didn't respond. I screenshot the message and added it to my evidence folder. Then I showed it to Officer Conway the next time he stopped by to check on me. He read it and asked if Madison had sent me any other threatening messages. I said no, just this one. He said it probably wasn't enough to press charges, but I should document everything she sent me. He suggested I block her number, but I said I wanted to keep the line of communication open in case she sent something more serious that I could use as evidence. He understood and said that was smart thinking. A few days later, Haley and I met with Rick in his office at the front of the apartment building. His office was small and cluttered with filing cabinets and stacks of paperwork. We sat in 2 chairs across from his desk, and he pulled out Madison's lease. He explained that Madison had signed a year lease with all 3 of us as co-tenants. She was legally responsible for her portion of the rent until the lease ended in 8 months. However, if she stopped paying Haley, and I would be responsible for covering her share or finding a new roommate to take over her portion. Rick said Madison had paid this month's rent before she moved out, but he didn't know if she would continue paying. He suggested we start looking for a potential roommate just in case. He said he would need to approve anyone new and run a background check. Haley asked what would happen if Madison came back and tried to move in again. Rick said legally she still had the right to live there since she was on the lease, but he had documented Jake's ban from the property, and if Madison brought Jake back, Rick could start eviction proceedings against her for lease violations. He said the eviction process took about 30 days, but during that time, Madison would still technically be a tenant. It was complicated and messy. Haley and I left his office feeling stressed about the whole situation. We decided to post an ad for a potential roommate right away just to be prepared. That same week, I started noticing a car I didn't recognize parked across the street from our apartment building. It was a dark green sedan with tinted windows. The first time I saw it was Tuesday evening when I got home from class. It was parked in the same spot Wednesday morning when I left for work. Wednesday evening it was still there. Thursday morning it was gone. But Thursday evening it was back. I started taking photos of the car from my apartment window. I zoomed in and got a clear shot of the license plate. I sent the photos to Officer Conway with a message explaining that this car had been parked outside my apartment at weird hours for the past few days. He responded saying he would run the plates and see who the car was registered to. An hour later, he called me. He said the car was registered to a guy named Derek Caldwell who lived on the other side of town. Officer Conway had looked up Derek in the police database and found that Derek had been arrested twice for assault and once for drug possession. He also found that Derek was friends with Jake on social media, and they had worked together at the warehouse job a few years ago. Officer Conway said Derek was probably watching my apartment on Jake's behalf, trying to intimidate me or gather information about my routine. He said he would pay Derek a visit and warn him to stay away from my building. The next day, Officer Conway called me back and said he had gone to Derek's house and confronted him about the surveillance. Derek claimed he just happened to be parking in that area to visit a friend nearby. Officer Conway told him that parking outside someone's apartment repeatedly could be considered stalking and harassment, especially given his connection to Jake, who had a restraining order against him. Officer Conway warned Derek that if he was seen near my apartment again, he would be arrested. Derek apparently got nervous and promised he wouldn't go near my building anymore. Officer Conway said the car hadn't been back since his visit. I thanked him for handling it so quickly. But even though the car stopped appearing, I felt paranoid now. Every time I walked to my car or came home late, I looked around constantly checking for people watching me. I varied my schedule like Officer Conway suggested, leaving at different times and taking different routes. I started parking in different spots around the building instead of my usual space. The whole situation had made me hyper-aware and anxious all the time. I couldn't relax even in my own apartment because I kept thinking about Jake sitting in jail planning his revenge and his friends out here doing his dirty work for him. I bought pepper spray and kept it in my purse. I made sure my phone was always charged in case I needed to call for help. I felt like I was living in constant fear, and I hated it. Jake's bail hearing happened 3 days later at the county courthouse downtown. I sat in the back row of the courtroom with my hands folded in my lap, trying to look calm even though my heart was pounding. The courtroom had wooden benches that creaked every time someone shifted their weight, and fluorescent lights that made everything look washed out and sterile. Jake was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit with his hands cuffed in front of him. He scanned the courtroom and his eyes landed on me for just a second, before the bailiff directed him to sit at the defense table next to his lawyer, Marshall DeWitt. Marshall was a younger guy, maybe in his 30s, with glasses and a suit that looked a little too big for him. He shuffled through papers in a manila folder while Jake sat there staring straight ahead with his jaw clenched. The prosecutor, Constance Burnett, stood at the other table organizing her own stack of documents. She was older, maybe 50, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, and she had this no-nonsense energy that made me feel slightly safer. The judge came in and everyone stood up, then sat back down when he waved his hand. He was an older black man with reading glasses perched on his nose, and he looked tired, like he'd seen too many cases like this one. Constance went first, laying out why Jake should stay in jail. She talked about how he violated his bail conditions by going to my apartment after Rick explicitly banned him, and how he had a documented pattern of intimidating witnesses. She mentioned Mrs. Coleman and how Jake had threatened her right in front of multiple people. She brought up the restraining order from his ex-girlfriend and the assault charge from the bartender. She said Jake posed a clear danger to the community and to potential witnesses in his upcoming trial. Marshall stood up when it was his turn and immediately started talking about Jake's mental health. He said Jake had anger management disorder, which was a legitimate medical condition that required treatment, not incarceration. He argued that keeping Jake in jail would prevent him from getting the therapy and medication he needed to manage his condition. He made it sound like locking Jake up was cruel and inhumane, like we were punishing someone for having diabetes or cancer. He said Jake wasn't a flight risk, and that he would comply with any conditions the court set, including staying away from my apartment and attending mandatory therapy sessions. The judge listened to both sides without showing much expression on his face. Then he looked down at the file in front of him and started reading through the police reports and bail violation documentation. The courtroom was completely silent except for the sound of papers rustling and someone coughing in the back row. Finally, the judge looked up and said he was denying bail. He said Jake had clearly violated the conditions of his previous release and showed a pattern of threatening behavior toward multiple people, including an elderly neighbor. He mentioned the restraining order and the pending assault charge, and said the combination of factors made Jake too much of a risk to release back into the community. He ordered Jake to remain in custody until his trial date. Jake's face went red and he started to stand up, but the bailiff put a hand on his shoulder and pushed him back down into his seat. Marshall tried to argue, but the judge cut him off, saying the decision was final. Then Jake turned around in his seat and stared directly at me. His eyes were full of pure hatred, like he was trying to burn a hole through my skull with his glare. His mouth twisted into this ugly sneer, and I could see his hands clenching into fists, even with the cuffs on. The bailiff noticed and stepped closer to Jake, blocking his view of me. They led Jake out through the side door back to the holding cells, and he kept his head turned, looking at me over his shoulder until the door closed behind him. I sat there for a minute after everyone else started leaving because my legs felt shaky, and I wasn't sure I could stand up without wobbling. Constance came over to me and asked if I was okay. I nodded and thanked her for everything she said in there. She told me this was the right outcome, and that I should feel safer knowing Jake would be locked up until trial. But I didn't feel safer. I felt like Jake's stare had followed me out of the courtroom and was still boring into the back of my head. That evening, my phone buzzed with a text from Madison. It was long, really long, like she'd been typing for a while, building up to send it. The message said I was responsible for Jake being locked up in a cage like an animal, when what he really needed was help and support. She said his mental health was getting worse every day he spent in jail without proper treatment. She wrote that the jail didn't have therapists who understood his condition, and that he was surrounded by violent criminals who didn't care about his medical needs. She said if anything happened to him while he was in there, it would be completely my fault, and I would have to live with that guilt for the rest of my life. She called me selfish and cruel and said I was using the legal system to punish someone for being sick. The text went on and on, with Madison saying I had destroyed her relationship and ruined Jake's chance at recovery. She said I was no better than the people who used to lock up mentally ill patients in asylums and throw away the key. She ended the message by saying she hoped I was happy now that I'd gotten what I wanted. I read the whole thing twice, feeling my stomach twist into knots. Part of me wanted to text back and explain everything again about how Jake wasn't sick, he was dangerous and violent, but I knew it wouldn't matter. Madison had convinced herself of this story where Jake was the victim and I was the villain, and nothing I said would change her mind. I took screenshots of the text messages and sent them to Officer Conway. He called me back 20 minutes later and I explained what Madison had sent. He was quiet for a moment, then said the text could potentially be considered harassment, but it probably wasn't enough to press charges. He said it was one message even though it was long and threatening, and that prosecutors usually wanted to see a pattern of contact before they'd take action. He suggested I block Madison's number so she couldn't send me anything else. He also told me to document any further contact from her, or anyone connected to Jake, including phone calls, emails, or people showing up at my apartment. He said to call him immediately if anything else happened and he'd see what he could do. I thanked him and hung up, then sat there staring at Madison's text on my screen. I wanted to block her number right away, but something made me hesitate. Maybe I wanted to see if she'd text again, or maybe I just wasn't ready to completely cut off someone who used to be my friend, even after everything that happened. 2 days later, I was making dinner in the kitchen when my phone rang from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer because I'd been getting a lot of spam calls lately, but something made me pick up. A woman's voice on the other end asked if this was me, and when I said yes, she introduced herself as Layla Terrell. The name didn't register at first until she said she was the bartender Jake had assaulted. My whole body went tense and I sat down at the kitchen table. Layla said she'd heard through the prosecutor's office that I had filed a restraining order against Jake. She wanted to thank me for standing up to him because she had been terrified to testify at his trial. Her voice was soft and a little shaky, like she was nervous about making this call. She said knowing that other people were willing to speak out against Jake made her feel less alone and more confident about going through with the court case. I told her I was sorry about what happened to her, and that Jake was a dangerous person who needed to be held accountable. Layla was quiet for a second, then asked if we could meet for coffee sometime. She said she wanted to talk to someone who understood what it was like to deal with Jake's threats and intimidation. I agreed immediately, and we made plans to meet at a cafe near campus the next afternoon. The cafe was one of those places with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls and the smell of coffee and baked goods. I got there first and ordered a latte, then sat at a table near the window watching people walk by outside. Layla arrived about 5 minutes later and I recognized her right away from the photos I'd seen in the police report. She was shorter than I expected with dark hair pulled into a ponytail, and she walked with a slight limp. She ordered her coffee, then came over and sat across from me. We made small talk for a minute about the weather and the cafe, but then Layla took a deep breath and started telling me about the night Jake attacked her. She said it was a Friday evening and the bar was busy with the usual weekend crowd. Jake had come in alone around 8 and ordered a beer. He was friendly at first, chatting with her about nothing important while she worked, but he kept ordering drinks, and by his 8th beer he was getting loud and aggressive with the other customers. Layla said she cut him off and told him he'd had enough and needed to call a cab or a friend to pick him up. Jake's whole demeanor changed instantly. He started yelling at her, calling her names, and saying she had no right to tell him what to do. Layla tried to stay calm and professional, explaining that it was bar policy, and she was just doing her job. But Jake got angrier and louder, and other customers started backing away. Then Jake jumped over the bar. Layla said it happened so fast she didn't have time to react. 1 second he was on the customer side yelling, and the next second he was right in front of her with his fist raised. He punched her in the face and she fell backward into the shelves of liquor bottles. Then he kept hitting her while she was on the ground trying to cover her head with her arms. The other bartenders and some customers finally pulled Jake off her, but not before he'd broken her nose and given her a concussion. Layla touched her face while she was talking, and I noticed a slight asymmetry to her features that must have been from the damage. She said she spent 2 days in the hospital and had to have surgery to fix her nose. She still had headaches and nerve damage on the left side of her face that made it hard to smile properly. Layla said Jake's lawyer Marshall had contacted her a few weeks after the assault. He tried to convince her to drop the charges by claiming Jake was having a mental health crisis and didn't mean to hurt her. Marshall said Jake had anger management disorder and that he was getting treatment and therapy. He made it sound like pressing charges would be cruel and unnecessary because Jake was already suffering enough from his condition. Layla refused. She said she had permanent nerve damage in her face and chronic pain that would probably last the rest of her life. She said Jake knew exactly what he was doing when he jumped over that bar and started hitting her. She didn't buy the mental health excuse because Jake had been calculated enough to wait until she was alone behind the bar before he attacked. If it was really just an uncontrollable episode, he would have lashed out at anyone nearby. But instead, he targeted her specifically because she was the one who cut him off. Layla said she was determined to testify at his trial no matter how scary it was because Jake needed to face consequences for what he did. She couldn't let him use a fake diagnosis to get away with violence. 2 weeks later, I had my full restraining order hearing at the courthouse. The temporary order I'd gotten before was only good for 14 days, so now I needed to go in front of a judge and explain why I needed a permanent one. Jake appeared on a video screen from the jail looking angry and defiant in his orange jumpsuit. Marshall sat in the courtroom at the defense table with a laptop showing Jake's video feed. The judge was the same one from the bail hearing, and he looked just as tired as before. I sat at the prosecutor's table with Constance, who was representing the state's interest in keeping the restraining order active. Marshall argued that the restraining order was unnecessary because Jake was currently incarcerated and posed no immediate threat to me. He said that once Jake was released after serving whatever sentence he might receive, he would be required to attend therapy and anger management classes, which would address the underlying issues. He claimed the restraining order was based on misunderstandings, and that Jake had never actually threatened me directly. I felt my face get hot listening to Marshall twist everything that had happened. When it was my turn to testify, I walked up to the witness stand and the bailiff had me swear to tell the truth. Constance asked me to describe Jake's behavior, and I told the judge about the threats Jake made in my apartment about how he got in my face and clenched his fists. I described the way he intimidated Mrs. de Coleman, and how he whispered that this wasn't over when Rick made him leave. I talked about Derek's car parked outside my apartment watching me, and how Officer Conway confirmed Derek was Jake's friend doing surveillance. I showed the judge screenshots of Madison's threatening text messages saying it would be my fault if anything happened to Jake in jail. I explained how scared I felt all the time knowing Jake was planning revenge against me for getting him arrested. The judge listened carefully and took notes while I talked. When I finished, Constance asked if I had anything else to add, and I said I was genuinely afraid of what Jake would do when he eventually got out of jail. Marshall tried to cross-examine me, asking if Jake had ever explicitly said he would hurt me. I said no, but that his behavior and body language made his intentions clear. Marshall said that wasn't enough for a restraining order, but the judge cut him off. The judge said he'd heard enough, and that based on my testimony and the documented evidence of Jake's pattern of behavior, he was granting a 1-year restraining order. He also extended the order to include Jake's known associates, which meant Derek and anyone else connected to Jake couldn't contact me on his behalf. Marshall objected, but the judge said the decision was final and dismissed us. When I got home that afternoon, Haley was sitting on the couch looking upset. I asked what was wrong, and she said she needed to tell me something. She explained that she'd been thinking a lot about everything that happened with Jake and Madison, and even though Jake was in jail now, the whole situation had made her too anxious to stay in the apartment. She said she kept having nightmares about Jake breaking in, or his friends showing up, and she couldn't relax or focus on her classes anymore. She'd decided to move out at the end of the semester and live with her boyfriend instead. I told her I understood completely and didn't blame her at all. The apartment had stopped feeling safe weeks ago, and I couldn't fault her for wanting to get away from all the stress and fear. Haley looked relieved that I wasn't mad, and we hugged. She promised we'd stay friends and keep in touch, but we both knew things would never be the same as before. Jake came into our lives and ruined everything. The victim advocate's office had fluorescent lights that buzzed and made my head hurt. The woman who met with me introduced herself, but I was too nervous to remember her name. She had a folder with Jake's case information and spread papers across the desk between us. She explained that Jake's trial was scheduled for 6 weeks from now, and that with his bail violation plus all the evidence I'd gathered about his pattern of behavior, they were confident about getting a conviction. She said the prosecutor, Constance Burnett, was building a strong case showing Jake deliberately targeted women, and used the mental health excuse to manipulate people into defending him. The advocate walked me through what would happen at trial and told me I'd probably be called to testify about Jake's threats and intimidation. She said my documentation of everything had been incredibly helpful, and that most victims didn't have such detailed records. I left feeling slightly better knowing the legal system was taking this seriously, but also terrified about having to face Jake in court and describe everything he'd done. 3 days later, I was home alone studying when someone knocked on the apartment door. I looked through the peephole and saw Madison standing there looking terrible. Her hair was messy, and she had dark circles under her eyes, and her clothes looked like she'd been wearing them for days. My first instinct was to not open the door, but something about how defeated she looked made me hesitate. I unlocked the door but kept the chain on and asked what she wanted. Madison's voice came out quiet and shaky, asking if we could talk. I told her Jake wasn't allowed anywhere near here, and she said she knew that and she was alone. I kept my phone in my hand with 911 ready to dial and let her inside. Madison walked to the couch and sat down in the same spot where Jake used to sit, and I stayed near the door in case I needed to run. She looked around the apartment like she was seeing it for the first time, and her eyes filled with tears. Madison started crying before she even said anything, and I just stood there not knowing what to do. She wiped her face with her sleeve and told me Jake's friend kicked her out because she couldn't pay rent anymore. She said she had nowhere else to go, and her parents weren't answering her calls, and all her other friends had stopped talking to her months ago. She looked at me with red, swollen eyes and said she was starting to think maybe Jake wasn't who she thought he was. I wanted to say no kidding, but she looked so broken that I kept quiet. Madison admitted that living with Jake's friend had been awful because the friend kept making comments about how Jake talked about her behind her back, and how Jake had done the same thing to other girlfriends before. She said she'd been sleeping in her car for 2 nights and didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to tell her this was her own fault for choosing Jake over everyone who tried to warn her, but another part of me remembered we used to be friends before Jake ruined everything. I told Madison she could stay in her room temporarily, but only if she agreed to 2 conditions. First, she needed to start seeing a therapist to work through whatever made her defend Jake's violence. Second, she had to completely cut off all contact with Jake, which meant no calls, no letters, no visits, nothing. Madison nodded and said she would do both things, and that she was sorry for everything she'd said and done. She looked genuinely sorry, but I'd seen her lie so many times that I didn't fully trust her. I told her this was her last chance, and if she brought Jake back into our lives in any way, she was out permanently. Madison promised she understood and went to her room. I heard her crying through the door for hours that night. Over the next week, Madison barely came out of her room except to use the bathroom or get food. When I did see her, she looked like a ghost, just shuffling around in pajamas with her hair unwashed. She slept most of the day, and I could hear her crying at random times through the walls. Haley came back and was shocked to see Madison had returned, but I explained the situation and said we needed to give her a chance. One night around 2 in the morning, I got up to get water and found Madison sitting at the kitchen table in the dark crying. I turned on the light and asked if she was okay, even though obviously she wasn't. Madison looked up at me and said Jake's friend had told her that Jake was cheating on her the whole time they were together. She said the friend showed her text messages between Jake and at least 3 other women where Jake called Madison crazy and said he was only with her because she was easy to manipulate. Madison put her head in her hands and sobbed, saying she'd defended him and pushed away everyone who cared about her, and the whole time he was laughing at her with other people. I sat down across from Madison and let her cry for a while before saying anything. She started talking about how Jake had slowly cut her off from her other friends over the past year. She said he would get upset whenever she made plans without him and would accuse her friends of not understanding their relationship. She realized now that he'd been isolating her on purpose so she'd have no one else to turn to. Madison said Jake used to tell her that her family didn't really love her and that only he understood her and cared about her. She talked about how he'd convinced her that everyone else was ableist and discriminatory and that she needed to protect him from people who didn't understand his condition. Madison looked at me with this expression of complete horror and said she finally understood that the mental health condition excuse was just a way for Jake to control her and make her defend his violence. She said she felt stupid for not seeing it sooner. I suggested Madison should talk to a counselor who specialized in domestic violence, and she immediately got defensive. She said she wasn't the one being abused because Jake never hit her. I chose my words carefully and explained that psychological abuse and manipulation were real forms of abuse even without physical violence. I told her that what she'd just described about Jake isolating her and controlling her and making her doubt her own judgment was textbook emotional abuse. Madison sat quiet for a long time before saying she never thought of it that way, because Jake always said he was the victim. She asked how she could find a counselor, and I told her I'd help her look for someone in the morning. Madison thanked me and went back to her room. I stayed up the rest of the night thinking about how Jake had damaged so many people and was still sitting in jail, probably planning his next manipulation. Madison went to her first counseling appointment the following week and came back looking shaken up. She sat on the couch staring at nothing, and when I asked how it went, she said the counselor had helped her see all the ways Jake manipulated and controlled her. Madison said the counselor walked her through the relationship timeline and pointed out all the red flags she'd ignored or explained away. She told me about something called DARVO, which stands for Deny, Attack, Reverse, Victim, and Offender, and how Jake had used that exact pattern every time someone confronted him about his behavior. Madison said she felt incredibly stupid for falling for such obvious manipulation, and that she couldn't believe she'd defended someone who hurt so many people. I told her she wasn't stupid, and that abusers like Jake were experts at finding vulnerable people and exploiting them. Madison asked if I thought she was a bad person for enabling Jake, and I said no, but that she needed to take responsibility for the harm she'd caused while under his influence. She nodded and said her counselor had told her the same thing. 6 weeks later, Jake's trial date finally arrived. I got called to testify first and had to sit in the witness box while Constance Burnett asked me questions about Jake's behavior. I described how Jake threatened me in my own apartment and how he got in my face and clenched his fists when I stood up to him. I talked about the way he intimidated Mrs. Coleman and smiled while doing it like he enjoyed scaring an elderly woman. I told the jury about the whispered threat Jake made when Rick forced him to leave and how I'd been afraid every day since then. I explained about his friend watching my apartment and Officer Conway confirming it was surveillance. I showed them screenshots of Madison's threatening messages saying it would be my fault if anything happened to Jake in jail. I described the constant fear of knowing Jake was planning revenge against me for getting him arrested. The jury members watched me closely, and some of them looked angry hearing about Jake's behavior. Then Layla took the stand and described the night Jake attacked her at the bar. She explained that she'd cut him off after 8 drinks because he was getting aggressive with other customers. She said Jake started yelling at her, calling her names and saying she was discriminating against him. When she asked him to leave, he jumped over the bar and started punching her in the face. Layla touched her cheek where you could still see a faint scar and said other staff members had to pull Jake off her. She described the hospital visit and the surgery she needed to repair nerve damage and how she still had numbness on one side of her face. Several jurors looked uncomfortable and one woman had tears in her eyes. Marshall DeWitt tried to argue that Jake had anger management disorder and needed treatment, not punishment. But Constance Burnett presented evidence showing Jake's behavior was calculated, not impulsive. She showed text messages where Jake planned confrontations and bragged about manipulating people. She brought up the multiple restraining orders and the pattern of targeting women specifically. She argued that someone with a genuine impulse control disorder wouldn't be able to plan and execute manipulation campaigns or choose victims strategically. The evidence made it clear Jake knew exactly what he was doing. The jury came back after 3 hours and I sat in the courtroom holding my breath while the foreman stood up to read the verdict. Guilty on all counts of aggravated assault. Jake's face went red and he started yelling that we all conspired against him, that the system was rigged, that everyone was discriminating against him because of his condition. The bailiffs had to physically restrain him while he screamed threats at the judge and jury. Madison sat next to me crying quietly, and I reached over to squeeze her hand, because even though Jake deserved this, watching someone completely lose control was scary. The judge banged his gavel and set sentencing for 2 weeks later, then ordered Jake removed from the courtroom. Jake fought the bailiffs the whole way out, still screaming that we'd all pay for this and that his lawyer would appeal. Marshal DeWitt looked defeated and started packing up his briefcase without saying anything to anyone. 2 weeks later, Madison and I walked into the courthouse together for Jake's sentencing. She'd been going to therapy twice a week and looked different now, more aware of everything around her instead of existing in the bubble Jake had created. We sat in the back row and watched Jake get brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit with his hands cuffed in front of him. He looked thinner than before and had dark circles under his eyes. The judge reviewed the case and noted Jake's prior restraining orders, the pattern of violence against women, and his complete lack of remorse. Then she sentenced him to 3 years in state prison, plus mandatory anger management counseling that would continue after his release. She added 5 years of probation after he got out and made all the restraining orders permanent for the full duration. Jake just stared straight ahead without reacting this time, like he'd finally run out of energy for his performance. Madison started crying again, but this time it felt different, like she was mourning the person she thought Jake was, rather than feeling sorry for the real person sitting up there. The bailiffs led Jake away, and he didn't look at any of us, didn't make threats or excuses, just walked out like he'd already checked out mentally. Outside the courthouse, Layla was waiting by the front steps, and when she saw me, she ran over and hugged me tight. She said she finally felt safe knowing Jake would be locked up for the next 3 years and couldn't hurt anyone else. Her face had healed, but you could still see the slight asymmetry where the nerve damage affected her smile. She told me she'd started a support group for other women Jake had targeted over the years, and asked if Madison and I wanted to join the next meeting. Madison nodded yes before I could even answer, and Layla gave her a hug too, saying she was proud of Madison for getting out and getting help. We exchanged numbers, and Layla said the group met every Thursday evening at the community center downtown. Walking back to my car, I felt this weird mix of relief and exhaustion, like I'd been holding my body tense for months and could finally relax, but didn't quite remember how. Thursday night, Madison and I drove to the community center and found the meeting room where 6 other women were already sitting in a circle. Layla introduced us and then went around the circle having everyone share their names and how they knew Jake. The first woman talked about dating Jake 2 years ago and how he'd isolated her from her family before she finally left. The second woman described Jake getting fired from her workplace after he threatened her for rejecting his advances. One by one, each woman told her story, and they all followed the same pattern. Jake would be charming at first, then controlling, then violent when he didn't get his way. He always had excuses and always blamed his victims for triggering his supposed condition. Madison listened with tears running down her face as she realized she wasn't special or different. Jake had used the exact same tactics on all of us, targeting women he thought were vulnerable and manipulating them systematically. When it was Madison's turn to share, she apologized to everyone for defending Jake and enabling his behavior. The other women were kind to her, and several said they'd done the same thing before finally seeing the truth. Layla ended the meeting by reminding us that Jake's manipulation wasn't our fault, and that recognizing the pattern was the first step to healing. The next weekend, Madison's parents drove up to visit, and we all sat in the living room having the most honest conversation they'd probably ever had as a family. Madison's dad apologized for not seeing the signs sooner and said he should have intervened when Jake first started isolating Madison. He looked genuinely upset with himself and kept saying he'd failed as a father. Madison's mom was harder to read because she still made some comments about how Jake seemed nice at first and how mental health is complicated. But when Madison's dad pushed back, his wife finally admitted she'd been in denial because accepting the truth meant accepting that her daughter had been in real danger. They agreed to start family therapy sessions together to better understand domestic violence dynamics and how to support Madison going forward. Before they left, Madison's dad pulled me aside and thanked me for not giving up on Madison even when she was pushing everyone away. He said most people would have just written her off, but I'd kept trying to help. Monday morning, I met with Rick in his office to discuss the apartment situation. He'd been following the whole case and knew Jake was now in prison for the next 3 years. Rick said he'd let Madison stay on the lease for the rest of the semester since she was getting professional help, and the immediate danger had passed. He also mentioned that Haley had called him asking if it was safe to come back now that Jake was locked up. I told Rick that Haley had every right to be cautious, but that Madison was completely different now and genuinely working on herself. Rick made some notes in his file and said he'd reach out to Haley directly to discuss her concerns. Walking back to the apartment, I felt grateful that Rick had been so supportive through everything instead of just evicting all of us to avoid the drama. With the Jake situation finally resolved, I could focus on finishing my semester strong. My grades had actually started improving because I wasn't constantly stressed about my safety or worrying about what Jake might do next. I'd been so distracted during midterms that I'd nearly failed 2 classes, but my professors had been understanding when I explained what was happening. They'd given me extensions on major assignments and let me retake 1 exam after the trial ended. Now I was catching up on all the work I'd fallen behind on, and actually enjoying my classes again, instead of just going through the motions. My psychology professor even asked if I'd consider sharing my experience with her domestic violence awareness class next semester, and I said I'd think about it. Madison started volunteering with the local domestic violence organization that ran Layla's support group. She went through their training program to become a peer counselor, and started helping other people recognize manipulation tactics before the abuse escalated. She told me that helping others process their experiences was helping her deal with her own guilt and shame about enabling Jake. Sometimes she'd come home from volunteering and we'd talk about the patterns she was seeing in other people's stories and how similar they were to what she'd experienced. She said her therapist told her that this volunteer work was part of her healing process, but that she needed to be careful not to take on too much emotional weight from other people's trauma, while still processing her own. 3 months after Jake's sentencing, Madison sat me down and said she'd been accepted to transfer to a different college next semester. The school was near her parents' house where she'd have more family support, and could make a fresh start away from all the memories of Jake. She looked nervous telling me this, like she thought I'd be mad, but I told her it made sense and that I supported her decision. She'd already talked to Rick about breaking the lease early, and he'd agreed to let her out without penalty given everything that had happened. We spent the next few weeks helping Madison pack up her room and sort through her belongings, deciding what to keep and what to donate. Haley had decided to come back and take over Madison's room for the spring semester, so at least I wouldn't have to find a new roommate. On Madison's last day, we took photos together and promised to stay in touch even though we both knew our friendship would never be what it was before Jake. Layla's support group kept growing, and by the end of the semester, there were 12 women attending regularly. The group had become more than just a place to share stories, because Layla had organized us to advocate for real change in how local businesses handled aggressive customers. We'd successfully lobbied the local bar association to implement better security training for staff dealing with violent patrons. Bartenders and servers now had clear protocols for when to cut people off, how to de-escalate situations, and when to call police without fear of retaliation from management. Several bars had installed panic buttons behind their counters that connected directly to police dispatch. The changes wouldn't undo what happened to any of us, but they might prevent the next Jake from hurting someone else. One afternoon, a few weeks after everything settled down, I heard a knock on my door and found Mrs. Coleman standing there holding a plate of homemade chocolate chip cookies wrapped in plastic. She pressed them into my hands before I could say anything, and her eyes got watery. She told me she wanted to thank me for making the building safe again, and that she'd been absolutely terrified during those weeks when Jake was around. She said she'd started keeping her phone next to her bed at night, and would jump at every sound in the hallway, worried he might come back and follow through on his threats. Mrs. Coleman squeezed my hand and said she was so grateful I'd stood up to him when Madison kept making excuses and trying to normalize his behavior. She told me a lot of people would have just moved out or looked the other way, but I'd done the right thing even when it was hard and scary. After she left, I sat on my couch eating the cookies and felt this weird mix of proud and sad, because standing up to Jake had been necessary, but it had also cost me a friendship that would never fully recover. On our last day living together, Madison, Haley, and I ordered pizza and sat around our kitchen table like we used to before everything happened. The conversation felt awkward at first, with lots of long pauses and forced smiles, but eventually we started talking honestly about everything that had happened. Madison apologized again for not listening to us about Jake, and for letting him manipulate her into defending his violence. She said her therapist had helped her understand that she'd been so desperate to feel needed and important that she'd convinced herself Jake's problems made her special for staying with him. Haley admitted she'd been scared to push back harder because she didn't want to make things worse, and I said I wished I'd involved Rick and the police sooner instead of hoping Madison would see reason on her own. We all agreed to stay in touch, and Madison promised to text us updates about her new school, but we also acknowledged that our friendship would never be what it was before Jake. Some things just break people apart even after the immediate danger passes, and trying to force it back to normal would be fake and exhausting for everyone. Spring semester started, and I moved into a new apartment across campus with 2 roommates I'd carefully vetted through multiple coffee meetings and reference checks. I'd learned to trust my instincts about people and set clear boundaries from the very beginning about what behavior I would and wouldn't accept in my living space. My new roommates Olivia and Jess were both quiet students who kept regular schedules and respected each other's space, which felt boring compared to the drama with Madison, but boring was exactly what I needed. I made sure our lease had clear guest policies and told them upfront about what had happened with Jake, so they'd understand why I was particular about who came into our apartment. They were completely understanding and said they appreciated having a roommate who took safety seriously, instead of pretending problems would just work themselves out. A year later, I'm doing really well in my classes and working part-time with the victim advocacy program that helped me navigate everything with Jake. I help other people understand the legal system and connect them with resources when they're dealing with dangerous situations, and it feels good to use what I learned to help others who are scared and confused. Madison is doing well at her new school according to her occasional texts, and she's been dating someone for 6 months who treats her with respect and doesn't use mental health language to excuse bad behavior. Layla's bar implemented all the new safety protocols we lobbied for and hasn't had a major incident since, and she tells me the panic buttons and de-escalation training have already prevented several situations from getting violent. Jake is still in prison serving his sentence and will be for another 2 years, and all of us have moved forward with our lives. We're stronger and wiser for having survived his manipulation and violence, and we use that knowledge to help protect other people from going through what we did.